So welcome back to Third Age Reforged, and today we will be taking a quick look at CARDOLAN, one of the three parts of the Broken Kingdom of Arnor, and of course this means they are Numenoria inheritors to a point. And they've got quite a few tiers of infantry, but we will start off with a quick look once again at their siege equipment. Standard ballista, of course, and again the same thing applies to the standard ballista as I've said for every faction. More likely to see it in a siege than out on an open field, purely because it's fairly difficult to sort of coax the enemy into attacking you, although as CARDOLAN you may very well want to try that, so it's possible that a piece of siege equipment is more likely as CARDOLAN than some other factions, although that is more likely to be the catapult to try and panic your enemy into coming towards you. They also do have access to the Trebuchet, however, which is something which only a few other factions in the game have access to, of course, but again this is something which even more so I would expect to see in a siege because of how wildly inaccurate it can be. But obviously if you're the defenders in a siege and you sort of coax the attackers into trying to attack through one single choke point, the Trebuchet can be an absolutely devastating tool which could potentially win you the battle. But of course, that is quite a niche sort of situation that you'll find yourself in. The Ramp of Minas Tirith is a pretty good place for that. Now they do have the civilians, which of course we have seen before, so I won't dwell too long on them, because they are a part of several of the good kingdoms of men. Obviously slightly higher attack than maybe you'd expect. But obviously they're going to get shredded in melee. Very little is going to have any trouble dealing with the civilians. They only cost 150 though, so if you've got a bit of spare money left over that you don't want to spend on upgrades, then maybe you want to spend it on some civilians to just be a buffer for something important. Moving on, however, we shall start off with a militia unit. The Greenwash Garrison Spearmen obviously used to be the Breland Militia, used to also be one of the worst units in the game if I remember correctly from vanilla. They obviously they can form Skiltron, which is somewhat unique for a unit like this nowadays. Obviously used to be much more common, but most units like this now could actually form shield walls, so I think that Skiltron is actually a lesser formation, so a bit of a shame there, but obviously they do have that bonus fighting cavalry. But one thing about the Greenwich Garrison Spearmen is their total defense, and that comes from their shield. This is their real selling point. They are one of the best tar pit units that you'll find in the good factions, purely for this reason. They make a fantastic absorber for arrows, and indeed in melee they're not all that easy to get rid of, to be honest with you. There's quite a lot of them, and their total defense is not half bad, but obviously they're terrible on the attack with only 3, and their spears, so they have that malice against infantry, so don't expect them to kill all that much, but you can use them to zone out cavalry and use them to absorb archers with their flowery shields. Now we move on to a somewhat low tier Axman, the Vaughn Axmen, which used to be called the Lumbermen of course, and based on their numbers, based on their stats, obviously effective against armour with their two-handed axes, but they are very similar to the Greenwood Lumbermen from Dale. That sort of unit is what you can compare them to, even to the Orc Maulers from Mordor to a certain extent. Obviously very cheap AP for your line if that is what you want. Based on CARDOLAN's relative lack of AP in their lines until you get to their very high tier infantry units, this might be something you want to invest in against certain factions, but do bear in mind of course they're going to be absolutely abysmal against enemy arrow fire with no shield and very low armour values. Moving on, however, we have a unit which actually has made a return to CARDOLAN's roster because it had been removed for a small amount of time, which is the Bandits. Obviously they can hide anywhere, which is good. It's a good bit of utility that it offered as CARDOLAN. They haven't got terrible stats either for 475, although, well, actually their stats aren't that great. I mean, they are worse than the Lake Town Infantry, who are around the same cost, but they can hide anywhere, which is the trade-off, so you can use them to ambush, but do bear in mind, of course, their stats aren't fantastic, so in a straight-up fight, they aren't going to do very well. Not a great shield value either, so even archers could really have their way with them. But as we move backwards into another shielded unit, which is a little bit better, we have the Mercenary Guilt. Of course, another unit that they share with several other factions. Obviously, we've already seen them in Khazad-dûm. Umbar have them as well. Just a sort of basic infantry unit that can be used to sort of help hold your line together. 180 of them in the unit, 575 to buy. Armour and shield is really where they sort of specialise in. Their defensive skill for a sword and board unit isn't all that good. But considering their price point, they're pretty decent to plug a gap in your line if you only have this amount of money left to spend on your roster. And of course they were originally an Erebor only unit, so it makes sense that they are still in the spiritual successor to Erebor. Now we have a unit which I do like quite a lot, and that is the Greenwash Garrison Footmen, the quintessential sort of lower tier pike unit. 500 to buy, so this puts them in the same sort of camp as the Lake Town Pikemen or the Corsair Pikemen from Umbar. Form Phalanx, obviously they've got a fantastic bonus fighting cavalry, should cavalry be daft enough to charge them from the front. Obviously their stats don't look great, but that's because pikes need those sorts of stats, otherwise they'd be grossly overpowered. So yeah, good at holding much superior units at bay for extended periods of time, very good on the front line, and you'll often see CARDOLAN bring quite a lot of them because they are cheap and they allow CARDOLAN to spend money elsewhere, which oftentimes CARDOLAN do need to do. Having said that, CARDOLAN do have a decent frontline infantry presence. In fact, it's an infantry presence which is very comparable to the likes of their neighbours over in Arthedain, starting off with the Minas Tirith Swordsman. Fantastic total defence, actually. This is the sort of thing which you'd expect to find in a Gondorian infantry unit. They cannot upgrade their armour, however, which is a bit of a negative mark against them, where several other factions can. But they start off with a high defence score, which is nice. Armour of 9, shield of 8, obviously, again, fairly low defensive skill of 3. And it's also worth mentioning that CARDOLAN have got a pretty shoddy morale across all of their infantry all the way through. So they are a little bit more susceptible to morale shocks, but again, that's something which we'll have to go through on the army selection screen at the end. Attack of 5 is relatively standard for a unit like this, but they're really pretty good. I mean, as long as their lower morale doesn't come into play too much, they will be able to hold the line for a pretty long time. Very solid unit to have on the front line. And an equally solid unit is, of course, the Spearmen equivalent, Minas Tirith Spears. Obviously, they add a bonus against cavalry and they can do shield wall, but obviously they trade this in for a lower attack and that malice against infantry, so they're going to be pretty bad at killing infantry, honestly. But they're going to be very tough to break through for archers, and obviously they do make a good deterrent against cavalry on your flanks. And then finally we've already seen the Mercenary Guildsmen, so of course it follows that the Mercenary War Chiefs would also make an appearance with their Zweihanders. Obviously a Swordsman unit, so instead of the Axman at the front, we're going to have a little bit more skill involved here. 725 is not a small amount of money to spend on them, however, so it is a bit of a gamble to bring them, but this is true for anyone who can bring the Mercenary War Chiefs to an extent. But if you feel as though you need a little bit more skill in your killing power on the front line, then the Mercenary War Chiefs are going to be one of your options to do so. Another option to do so, however, is a little bit more cloak and dagger, and that is the Thieves of Thar Bad, who actually are an assassin unit, although I think they are the only assassin unit in the game to not have a projectile, which is a bit of a mark against them, but they do cause fear. They're effective against armour and melee, which not all assassins are, I don't think. So that effectiveness against armour and melee is a pretty big deal with those two scythes that they wield. Good defensive skill of 14, obviously their armour is pretty low, their shield is non-existent, decent attack, but they're cheap for an assassin unit as well. 750 is not the most for this. Obviously they're not as good as several other units in the same class, but obviously being able to hide anywhere, being able to catch the enemy out is a pretty decent unit. I mean, it's not going to be able to beat something like the Brotherhood Shadowblades, but it's still going to be able to do relatively the same job while costing a little bit less. And now we have quite an important unit for CARDOLAN, potentially, and that is the Wardens of Tim Goth. Their higher tier pike unit, of course, you can only have one before the cost increases, but this is going to be one of your units which is going to keep your infantry in the fight, because it is going to be able to inspire nearby troops. Obviously, again, it has all of the attributes of pikes, but it also has better stats all around, excuse me. Primarily, though, the significant things are the higher attacks. It means they're going to be able to deal with units which are going to be crashing down upon their formation a little bit more quickly. And their armour values of 11, which means they're slightly less vulnerable to arrow fire at range and are able to stand up a little bit longer in melee. But honestly, with their lack of a shield, enemy archers are still going to want to be targeting the Wardens of Tim Goth a lot. But they are a very good tool for keeping your infantry in check. And now we move on to, other than the Axman at the front, CARDOLAN's only infantry that has AP, well, the Thieves of Thar Bad as well, but the only infantry unit which is designed for a fair frontline engagement, the Thar Bad Warhammers, which are of course multiple HP Warhammer units, multiple HP two-handed shock infantry. A bit of a rare breed in the current build of the game. Rudauer have one, Angmar have one, and Dale have one, in addition to CARDOLAN. Other than that, though, nothing. Now, in terms of stats across the board, 1200 is what they cost. They are a little bit worse, I think, than the Angmar equivalent, the Witch Realm Hammer Guard, but they are a little bit cheaper to sort of make up for this. And obviously, the inspiration that they provide can also be extremely key to keeping CARDOLAN's somewhat shaky front line in check. But they're capable of dishing out incredible amounts of damage. I mean, an attack of 20, which is armor piercing, is no laughing matter for a faction like the Dwarves, for example. And then we move on to previously the unit that was known as the Battle Ready Dunedain, the Dunedain Captains. Obviously, again, 1200. They're the Swordsman variant, so a little bit more skill based. They can also hide in woods, which is nice. Obviously, they inspire nearby troops as well. But again, this is for unarmoured opponents or more lightly armoured opponents. So someone like the Elves, for example, the Dunedain Captain can mix it with the best of the Elves in many cases. Obviously, with a defensive skill of 15, nice attack value of 22 as well. And also they have a very nice looking armour upgrade here, which is obviously going to make them just that little bit stronger in melee. Obviously with the armour value of 8, just makes it a little bit more powerful. But now we shall move on to Cardolan's Skirmishes and their Cavalry, which is going to need to work hard to keep its shaky infantry line in check for the most part. So naturally, how you use this section of Cardolan's army can often be the difference between victory and defeat. Not that their infantry line is bad, but you do need to accent that with the Skirmishes and the Cavalry if you're going to have any sort of sustained success playing as them. Starting off with the Greenwash Garrison archers that we have here at the front. 400 is a very low outlay to spend on an archer unit. It's less than many of the Orc factions will spend on theirs. But there is a reason for this, and that is that they are pretty woeful under sustained fire. But you can still use them in the same way that the Orcs use their low tier archers, in exactly the same way. In fact, you don't expect them to individually be able to overpower any other archer really. But they will still be able to bury the enemy below a torrent of low quality arrows, which is exactly what you want to do. And obviously they do have an armour upgrade as well, although once again it's one of those units which doesn't really have too much an effect on their physical appearance. But again, as we have seen with all of the Orc archers pretty much, and some of the Evil Men factions actually, this is something which Cardolan can bring to the table as well. Very cheap for a unit like this. But if you want to go for a little bit more quality in terms of their lower end archers, you do have the Gwathlo trackers, which again, cheap. 450 is not a lot to spend on a unit, especially one that can hide. You know, this is a trait which is usually reserved for the likes of the Elves, for example, from the Woodland Realm. Now obviously they're not any sort of patch on the Elves in terms of quality, but they do have a missile attack of 5, which for a unit which only costs 450, that's a bigger missile attack than Orc archers, which cost more than 450. Now obviously there are only 163 of them per unit, so there's not going to be quite as much arrows flying down range, and only an armor value of 4 and a shield of 0. Woeful melee stats. So they're like Walmart Rangers, if you want to picture them that way. You know, they don't have body piercing, they don't have really all that much in terms of melee stats going on, but they are cheap, so that's something. They can hide just like Rangers as well, so they're basically the same thing, right? Having a look over here, we do have the Minas archers, which again, most human factions are going to have a heavier archer, which is going to be better under sustained arrow fire, and that's true for the Minas archers as well. Shield value of 4, armour of 9, pretty decent, not quite on the same level as something like the Bardian Marksman or the Abrazani Nadubawi, but perhaps you could look at them in the same vein as the Balagire archers, only slightly more expensive for the price of being slightly more, but obviously they cannot have their armour upgraded, so what you see is what you get with them. But now we move on to one of the things which make Cardolan quite scary to play against for certain factions, and that is the first of their crossbow units, the Minas sharpshooters. Of course, quite similar in terms of melee stats to the unit which is standing next to them, the Minas archers. But the one, well, other than the crossbows, of course, which we've spoken about before, as long as you have a clear line of sight on your target, crossbows are going to rip through most units, even if they're not armoured, because obviously the AP doesn't count against units per se, but most of the time you can find better targets than just lightly armoured militia. They do cost 800, which is a fair amount of money, but they are also AP in melee. They pull out maces in melee, which means they're pretty good, sort of backup infantry, I suppose you'd call them, in melee. And considering Cardolan's lack of sort of frontline anti-armour troops, the Minas sharpshooters can fulfill that role at range and in melee. But of course, it's a big investment, so you do need to use them wisely, because if you send them into melee too early or they get charged or something like that, then that's 800 florins down the drain, and your army composition may very well rest on the success of your crossbows, so you do want to be careful with them. They do have genuine rangers as well as just the Gwathlo trackers. The Dunedain Rangers, a unit they share with their neighbours over in Arthedain, of course. And once again, Dunedain Rangers, same as any other ranger, body piercing, missile attack of 5. Not terrible in melee because of their high defensive skill, but for the most part they're not going to win any awards there. But potentially able to get in excess of 700 kills in the right sort of position and the right sort of situation. So they do need to be kept tabs on if you're playing against Cardolan. A bit of an investment, however, 850, and you may want to spend it elsewhere. In particular, this is a very dangerous unit that Cardolan can field, the Menatar Romen Guardians, of course. The Halberdier crossbow hybrid, which is very, very powerful. Obviously, back in the days when they were called the Gatekeepers, they were one of the strongest units around. They are still very powerful. I mean, they are 1,000 each, so they are very expensive. They obviously have that bonus against cavalry and effectiveness against armour in melee. Decent melee stats across the board, and of course they have a better total defence than most dedicated halberds, purely because of their very high armour values of 11, and this is an armour value which can of course be upgraded. So if we have a look over here, we can obviously see that they've got their full plate on. Very, very difficult to skirmish down from afar with an armour value of 12 and a shield value of 5. So a crossbow that can stand up to ranged pressure is always very, very nice indeed. It means the enemy are going to have to try and get into melee to shut them down. And the enemy will want to shut them down because they can be a real menace to cavalry who are trying to sort of buzz your lines. The only real General's Bodyguard unit that we have here, however, are the Hearthguard of Amon Sul, who are of course heavily armoured spearmen with multiple HP in melee, but also they do have those missile attack as well. Missile damage of 7, pretty decent. They inspire nearby troops, of course, which could potentially be very, very important if you've got them in the heart of your infantry line. Obviously they have that bonus against cavalry and melee once again, so a lot of their skirmishes actually do have an effectiveness against armour or a bonus against cavalry, or both. So it does make their skirmish line a little bit more risky to go after in a one-to-one fight. You need to be prepared to take some casualties in many cases. But obviously multiple HP, very, very difficult to skirmish with because they are so tanky. And also in melee, very difficult to wear down. They do actually have an equivalent unit now. Pre-hotfix, they were kind of the only unit of this type, but Umbar now have a very similar unit to the Hearthguard, but a very good place to put your general because of its all-round utility and survivability. Relative safety can be found there as well. Having a look at their melee, well, their cavalry, starting off with their melee cavalry, we have the Mercenary Cavalry, which is obviously a unit we've seen before. Khazad-dûm rely on them pretty heavily to sort of do their business. Obviously decent melee cavalry, only cost 600. There are quite a few melee cavalry units which are better, but the baseline is essentially the Merc Cavalry, and they can do a really good job at safeguarding your higher tier cavalry, which is for the most part entirely Lancers. In fact, it is entirely Lancers, other than the Mercs, and obviously they do have an armour upgrade as well, which interestingly enough makes them dirtier, which is a strange one, but there you go. Meanwhile, speaking of dirty, we can see the Thar Bad Riders are over here looking like they have just been rolling around in a swamp. And obviously the Thar Bad Riders, one of the things which has been their thing for quite a long time is an extremely high charge bonus for their cost. No other Lance unit that costs 850 I think can boast the full charge bonus of 20, which is of course AP. But they pay for this by having the same morale problems that a lot of CARDOLAN's basic infantry has, and they're really not great in a sustained fight, only a defensive skill of 6. So you know, essentially with Lancers you really want to keep them moving. That goes doubly so for the Thar Bad Riders, but if you use them correctly they can do extreme amounts of damage to the enemy. They don't have an armour upgrade though, I believe. At least I tried to upgrade their armour and it wouldn't let me, so there you go. Moving on however to something which is a little bit more, it's just, I suppose you call it a safer pick. I mean, it is more expensive, the Dunedain Commanders. They do inspire nearby troops, obviously they still have that armour piercing charge. It's not quite as powerful as the Thar Bad Riders. However, they are a little bit better in sustained melee, so they do have that defensive skill. They have that that total defensive value essentially. So if they do get caught in melee, it's not the end of the world for them like it is for the Thar Bad Riders. And I believe most of the Dunedain units have got locked morale as well, so that is a very big difference between them and the Thar Bad. And then if we look over here, obviously they have that full plate model that the Dunedain captains had. And it's a very similar story here for essentially just the General's Bodyguard variant, the Royal Court of House Thorondor, and obviously multiple HP Lancers that inspire nearby troops, frighten nearby enemy infantry, so if you get a hammer and anvil charge with them it's pretty much game over for anything that isn't locked morale for the most part. Obviously 2 HP as well does make a big difference. 1200, not a completely unreasonable amount of money to spend on them. They're very fast as well, very much the CARDOLAN equivalent of the Black Serpents from Harad. And there you can see Gandalf, who again is looking muddy. They actually don't have the full plate variant when you upgrade their armour, which is a little bit strange, but there you go. So for the most part that is CARDOLAN's very Lancer focused cavalry, with the Mercs as the exception, and their very powerful skirmish line potentially, but which is really centred around their crossbows. Obviously this is something which they do better than anyone else, even Isengard, which is saying something. So that is CARDOLAN. So let's go back to the army selection screen and talk a little bit more about what I think of them. So just seeing here, obviously morale of 6, morale of 9. I mean, a morale of 6 is lower than the lowest of the goblins from the Misty Mountains, so that's obviously very bad. The civilians have got a higher morale than the Axman. That's rather amusing. But obviously, yeah, I mean, if you have a look here at the Thar Bad Riders, morale of 12 is a potential stumbling block because most cavalry of that cost generally has more. And that is really possibly the biggest challenge to overcome with CARDOLAN, their tendency to rout fast than quite a lot of the other good factions. I think when you're playing as the Kingdoms of Men, you expect to have a little bit more rigidity about you than the Orcs that are sort of crashing down upon you. Not necessarily the case with CARDOLAN, which is perhaps why they are considered a little bit more difficult to play than several other factions. They do have some really good parts to them, however, like the ability to blanket their line with cheap pikes. They've got a lot of anti-cavalry in their line. You know, using cavalry against CARDOLAN, perhaps one of the hardest factions to really effectively use cavalry against in the game. Someone like Rohan is likely going to have some real issues against CARDOLAN. Obviously Khand can sort of offset this by really trying to entrap CARDOLAN's Lancers in melee with their melee cavalry. But, you know, getting cavalry to really work out is difficult with all of these crossbows, pikes, halberds and spears around. But really Cardolan's weakness does come into play when you try and engage them in a straight infantry fight and try to morale shock them. But even then, you've got options to deal with that. Obviously, if you have a lot of pikes, it's going to be difficult to sort of quickly hack your way through them. And if you keep them in line with some units that inspire, like the Wardens of Tim Goth, or the Dunedain Captains, or Thar Bad Warhammers, then you could have a lot of success. There's a bit of ambush potential in here as well, with the Bandits and the Thieves of Thar Bad in melee, the Gwathlo Trackers, and the Dunedain Rangers at range. Lots of potential options for Cardolan. I quite like playing as Cardolan purely because of their ability to be really annoying to enemy cavalry. It really, because one of the things that I'm personally quite bad at is dealing with enemy cavalry. So Cardolan do offer you a bit of breathing space there, but I am pretty bad at the game overall. And Cardolan are not the easiest faction to get the most out of. If you sort of build your army wrong, you can quickly find yourself routing, particularly in the face of factions who've got quite a lot of units at their disposal and also who can inflict quite a bit of fear. Someone like Harad or the Misty Mountains can be quite good against Cardolan for this reason, but even so, bit of an acquired taste perhaps. If you like crossbows, however, then you're going to like Cardolan, because they certainly have the most robust crossbows in the game overall, simply because you can bring, I think, 3 of them overall, and they're all going to be of pretty good quality and pretty decent in melee at that. So yeah, Cardolan, I like them. I'm not very good with them, but I like them. And I think the next faction we will be taking a look at as we sort of cycle back round to the kingdoms of Elves and Dwarves, I think we will be taking a look at Erebor next. So yeah, I hope you found this somewhat informative, and I hope you will join me for that.